Okay, so what happens is that the Anglo-Texans especially, but also with their Tejano allies, Navarro, Ruiz, Seguin, they start organizing. And there's a couple of conventions in the early 1830s in the context of the law of April 6th, 1830, which I know is a mouthful, but it really is such a significant moment on the road to the Texas Revolution. And just the shorthand for that is that Anglos are shut out of Texas. If you come into Anglo-Americans, if you come into Texas from the United States, you're breaking the law. You certainly can't bring slaves into Texas anymore. And so what the folks that are in Texas, they want to negotiate with the government in Mexico City. They want to convince the government to rescind the law of April 6th, 1830. They're not ready for a revolt yet. They're hoping to make the government in Mexico City, the national government, change its mind about things like Anglo-American immigration from the U.S., slave immigration from the U.S. They want Texas to be a separate standalone state within the Mexican Republic. But the deal breaker for them is that Texas needs to be the single state in Mexico in which slavery exists. And the argument there is that, of course, slavery will allow for the production of cotton, which will bring great wealth to the Mexican Northeast, really for the first time in its history. And also it will increase the population, and it will help in the fighting of Indians, because the Indians I haven't talked about them in a while, but they certainly haven't gone away. This is one of the reasons that way back when when Moses Austin shows up, why he signs off on the agreement to allow the 300 families to come into Texas, which happens under his son. They're hoping that the Spanish and later the Mexicans are hoping that the Americans can be a shield against Indians. And again, the Indians haven't gone away. So you have a couple of conventions, and I'm not going to get too bogged down in the weeds, but there's a convention in 1833. And you have a couple of important figures that show up at that convention. The first is Sam Houston. Sam Houston's super interesting character. His mentor was Andrew Jackson, who just happened to be president of the United States. They're both from Tennessee. You can imagine what Mexicans thought about that. That the mentee of Andrew Jackson, the protege of the president of the United States, just happens to find himself in Texas. I mean, come on, that seems suspicious. What had happened is that Houston had reached a rocky point in his career. He'd been elected governor of Tennessee, and he'd married a young woman. And we think what happened is he had a war wound that still secreted pus, and his wife was disgusted by that. We don't know for sure, but what happened is that Houston left his wife, divorced his wife, quit being governor of Tennessee. He went and lived among the Cherokee in Tennessee, and he was drunk for a year or so. In fact, the Cherokee, who had great affection for Sam Houston, and he had great affection for them, they called him, now I'm talking about the Cherokee now, not the Comanche, don't get them mixed up. The Cherokee were much more settled farmers than the Comanche. They called Sam Houston the Big Drunk. Anyway, Houston dried himself out, straightened himself out, and he did what a lot of folks did during that time and throughout the 19th century, all the way up into 2020 and into the future. He came to Texas for a new start. It was like a blank slate. He's going to come into Texas, and Texas is very promising. The future's promising, and maybe he can get his career back on its feet again, which is actually true. So anyway, Sam Houston appears on the scene at this point. But again, from the point of view of the Mexican government, very suspicious that the protege of Andrew Jackson just happens to show up in Texas. And what this meeting does, they tell Austin, Stephen F. Austin, who has come under great suspicion at this point because of all the troubles between Mexico City and Texas. Austin has lost a lot of his legitimacy. because the Mexican government has cracked down on immigration into Texas from the US and cracked down on slavery. So Austin has lost a lot of his legitimacy. He's not very popular anymore, and he's not very respected. He is told, he's ordered to go to Mexico City in 1833. We're just 3 years away from the Texas Revolution. He's ordered to go to Mexico City and to negotiate with the government in Mexico, and to negotiate especially the idea of Texas becoming a standalone state separate from Coahuila, but also that he negotiate an end to the law of April 6th, I'm just going to call it that from now on, that stopped immigration from the US. They also want, if they can, to allow the reintroduction of slaves back into Texas. And so Austin goes to Mexico City he's under a cloud. He's under a cloud because many Texans have decided they just can't trust him anymore. He gets into Mexico City in the summer of 1833. He has some negotiations, but things ultimately fall apart. And he leaves Mexico City. He comes back towards Texas, and he writes a letter, which was kind of uncharacteristic of him because he was usually pretty discreet. And in this letter, he recommended that the people of Texas organize a local government independent of Coahuila, even though a general government withheld its consent. So when Austin comes back to Texas in 1834, he's not calling for Texas to break from Mexico. He's calling for Texas to, on its own, declare itself an independent state within Mexico. Okay, so we're not at the Texas Revolution yet. But what happened is the letter was discovered by spies. It was a very indiscreet letter. Stephen F. Austin was thrown into jail by officials in Mexico City. He was arrested, and he will not return to Texas until September of 1835, really just about 6 or 7 months before the Alamo. By the way, Stephen F. Austin dies very quickly after the Texas Revolution is over. He's dead by the end of 1836. He kind of morphs into a little bit of a tragic figure. But at this point, he's thrown in jail in Mexico City. He's recommended that the people of Texas, on their own, create a separate Mexican state within the Mexican nation. And for writing that letter, he gets thrown in jail. And at the same time, in Texas, people view him with great suspicion.